in the vast and trackless wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, where the sun hammers down upon barren rock and sand with a ferocity that seems almost personal, where the air shimmers with heat morajas that transform distant mountains into wavering apparitions, and where the silence of the desert is broken only by the occasional cry of a circling raptor, or the whisper of wind across stone, there stood in the 13th century before the Common Era an encampment of such size and complexity that its description in ancient texts has challenged the imagination of readers for more than 3,000 years. The people who had assembled in this forbidding place were the Israelites, refugees from bondage in Egypt, fugitives from the greatest military power of the ancient Near Eastern world, and they had gathered at the foot of a mountain that would forever afterward be associated with the most profound encounter between the human and the divine recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. According to those Scriptures, the mountain itself had been transformed by the presence of God into a site of such terrifying holiness that even to touch its base was to invite instant death, and from its summit, wreathed in smoke and fire, descended the thunderous voice of the Almighty, delivering to his chosen people the laws by which they were to live. Yet among all the ordinances and commandments that the Israelites received during their encampment in this wilderness, none would prove more consequential for the subsequent history of their religious practice than the detailed instructions for the construction of a single sacred object, a chest of specific dimensions fashioned from acacia wood and overlaid with gold, which would serve as the dwelling place of God's presence among his people, and which would be known throughout the centuries to come as the Ark of the Covenant. The significance of this object to the ancient Israelites cannot be overstated, for it represented something unprecedented in the religious experience of the ancient world, a portable shrine that was believed to contain within its golden confines the very presence of the creator of the universe, the God who had brought the Israelites out of Egypt with signs and wonders, who had divided the waters of the sea before them, who had fed them with bread from heaven and water from the rock, and who had now descended upon this mountain in fire and smoke to establish with them an eternal covenant. The religions of Egypt and Mesopotamia, of Canaan and the Hittite kingdoms, all centered upon temples and shrines that were fixed to particular locations, sacred sites where the gods were believed to dwell in their carved images and where their worshippers came to offer sacrifice and petition. The God of Israel, by contrast, had chosen to dwell among a people who possessed no fixed abode, wanderers in the wilderness who moved from encampment to encampment at the direction of the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and the vessel of his presence was therefore designed to move with them, carried on the shoulders of priests through the trackless wastes, until such time as his people might enter into the land he had promised to their ancestors and establish there a permanent shrine. The instructions for the construction of this most sacred object are preserved in the 25th chapter of the book of Exodus, delivered to Moses during his first extended sojourn on the summit of Mount Sinai, where he remained for 40 days and 40 nights in the presence of God, receiving not only the stone tablets inscribed with the 10 fundamental commandments, but also the elaborate specifications for the entire tabernacle complex that would serve as the center of Israelite worship throughout their wilderness wanderings. The ark itself was to be fashioned from acacia wood, a tree that grew in the wadis and valleys of the Sinai region, and was prized for its durability and resistance to decay, qualities that made it suitable for an object intended to endure throughout the generations. The dimensions prescribed were precise, measuring 2.5 cubits in length, 1.5 cubits in breadth, and 1.5 cubits in height, which according to the standard cubit of approximately 18 inches would have made the chest roughly 3¾ feet long and 2¼ feet in both width and height. This wooden core was to be overlaid with pure gold both inside and out, creating a chest that gleamed with the precious metal most associated in the ancient world with divinity and kingship, and around the top of this golden chest was to run a decorative moulding of gold, a border that emphasized the container's sacred status and set it apart from all ordinary objects. The means by which the ark was to be transported received particular attention in the divine instructions, for this was an object so charged with holiness that it could not be handled directly by human hands without inviting catastrophe. 4 rings of gold were to be cast and attached to the 4 feet of the ark, 2 rings on each side, and through these rings were to be passed 2 carrying poles made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold, poles that were never to be removed from the rings, so that the ark might be lifted and carried at a moment's notice, without anyone needing to touch the chest itself. The priests who carried these poles would walk with the ark suspended between them, their bodies never coming into contact with the sacred object, their hands gripping only the long shafts of gilded wood that served as the sole, permissible point of connection between the human and the divine presence that dwelt within. This arrangement represented a careful balance between accessibility and unapproachability, for the God of Israel wished to dwell among his people and to move with them through the wilderness, yet his presence remained of such overwhelming holiness that direct contact was impossible for mortal flesh to endure. The most elaborate portion of the divine instructions concerned the covering of the ark, a solid gold lid that bore the Hebrew name kapparet, traditionally rendered in English as the mercy seat, though modern scholarship has noted that the term derives from the Hebrew root meaning to cover or to atone, suggesting that this golden lid was understood as the place where atonement for sin was made and where divine mercy was extended to the people of Israel. This mercy seat was to be fashioned from pure gold, beaten or cast into a slab measuring 2.5 cubits in length and 1.5 cubits in breadth to match the dimensions of the ark beneath it, and rising from its surface at either end were to be 2 figures of cherubim, winged celestial beings whose precise appearance has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, but which the ancient Israelites would have understood as the guardians of holy spaces, the mighty creatures who stood watch at the threshold between the earthly and the heavenly realms. These cherubim were not to be made separately and attached to the mercy seat, but were to be hammered out of the same piece of gold, emerging organically from the lid itself, their wings spreading upward and forward to overshadow the mercy seat with their span, their faces turned inward toward each other and downward toward the golden surface between them. It was between these 2 cherubim, hovering above the mercy seat, that the presence of God was understood to dwell, and it was from this place that the voice of God would speak to Moses, communicating the divine will to the leader of Israel whenever he entered the innermost sanctuary to seek guidance for his people. The craftsman to whom fell the awesome responsibility of transforming these divine specifications into physical reality was a man named Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur of the tribe of Judah, whose selection for this task is recorded in the 31st chapter of Exodus as a matter of direct divine appointment. The text declares that God had filled Bezalel with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, understanding and knowledge, and with ability in every kind of craft to devise artistic designs for work in gold, silver and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood for every kind of craft. This remarkable statement elevated the work of the artisan to the level of prophetic calling, suggesting that the skills required to fashion the sacred vessels of the tabernacle were not merely technical proficiencies acquired through human training, but were themselves gifts of the divine spirit, bestowed upon a chosen individual so that the dwelling place of God might be constructed according to the heavenly pattern that Moses had seen upon the mountain. Bezalel was assisted in his work by a man named Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan, and together these master craftsmen oversaw the vast labour of construction that engaged the entire Israelite community in the months following their departure from Sinai. The materials required for the construction of the ark and the other sacred vessels of the tabernacle were collected through a voluntary offering of the people, who contributed so generously from the wealth they had carried out of Egypt that Moses eventually had to issue a proclamation restraining further gifts, for the craftsmen reported that the people were bringing more than enough for the work the Lord had commanded. Gold came from the jewellery and ornaments that the Egyptians had pressed upon the departing Israelites in their eagerness to see them gone after the devastation of the plagues, and this gold was melted down and refined for its new sacred purpose. The acacia wood was harvested from the groves that grew in the more sheltered valleys of the Sinai wilderness, transported back to the encampment by work parties, and carefully prepared for the overlaying process that would transform it into a fitting receptacle for the divine presence. The work proceeded under Bezalel's direction, according to the specifications that Moses had received upon the mountain, and when it was completed, the ark stood as the most sacred object that human hands had ever fashioned, a chest of gold containing within it the stone tablets upon which the finger of God had inscribed the fundamental terms of the covenant between the Almighty and his chosen people. The contents of the ark, as described in the Hebrew scriptures, included first and foremost those 2 tablets of stone, traditionally called the tablets of the testimony, or the tablets of the covenant, upon which were inscribed the 10 commandments that formed the core of Israelite law and ethics. These tablets had a troubled history even in the earliest days of their existence, for according to the narrative of Exodus, Moses had descended from the mountain with the original set of tablets, only to discover that during his 40-day absence, the people had persuaded his brother Aaron to fashion a golden calf as an object of worship, and in his fury at this apostasy, Moses had shattered the tablets upon the ground at the foot of the mountain. A second set of tablets had subsequently been inscribed to replace those that Moses had broken, and it was this second set that was ultimately placed within the ark, bearing the same commandments as their predecessors, but serving also as a reminder of the covenant's fragility and of the people's tendency to wander from the path of faithfulness. Later traditions recorded in the letter to the Hebrews in the Christian scriptures and in various rabbinic sources suggested that the ark also contained a golden pot of manna, the miraculous bread from heaven that had sustained the Israelites throughout their wilderness wanderings, and the staff of Aaron that had miraculously budded and borne almonds as a sign of his divine appointment to the priesthood, though the Book of Kings notes that by the time Solomon's temple was constructed, only the 2 stone tablets remained within the ark. The ark's place within the larger architectural scheme of the tabernacle was carefully prescribed to emphasize its supreme sanctity and to establish a graduated approach to the divine presence that would shape Israelite worship for the next 5 centuries. The tabernacle itself was a portable tent sanctuary of considerable size and elaborate construction, measuring roughly 45 feet in length and 15 feet in both width and height, its framework of acacia wood overlaid with gold supporting a series of coverings that included finely woven linen curtains embroidered with cherubim, layers of goat hair and animal skins, and an outermost covering that protected the structure from the elements of the desert. This sanctuary was divided into 2 chambers by a veil of blue, purple and scarlet yarn woven with gold thread and decorated with the images of cherubim, creating an outer chamber known as the Holy Place, where the golden lampstand, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense were located, and an inner chamber known as the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant alone resided. Only the priests of Aaron's lineage were permitted to enter the holy place to tend the sacred furnishings, and only the high priest was permitted to pass beyond the veil into the Holy of Holies, and he only on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, when he would enter with incense and sacrificial blood to make atonement for his own sins and for the sins of all the people. The rituals that surrounded the ark and governed its proper treatment were numerous and exacting, reflecting the awesome holiness of the object and the mortal danger that attended any improper contact with the divine presence. When the cloud that guided the Israelites by day lifted from above the tabernacle, signalling that the camp was to break and move to a new location, the priests were to enter the Holy of Holies and cover the ark first with the veil that normally separated it from the outer chamber, then with a cloth of blue, and finally with a covering of fine leather, before the carrying poles were taken up and the sacred object was transported to the next encampment. This triple covering ensured that even during transit the ark remained invisible to ordinary sight, its form shrouded from the gaze of the Levites who carried it, and from the Israelite host that marched behind. The order of march placed the ark at the head of the entire assembly, leading the people through the wilderness as the visible sign of God's presence going before them. Yet the people were required to maintain a specified distance from the ark, forbidden to approach too closely to the object that embodied the presence of their God. The wilderness years through which the ark accompanied the Israelites stretched over 4 decades according to the biblical narrative, 40 years of wandering that saw the generation that had left Egypt die out and be replaced by their children, who would be the ones to enter the promised land. Throughout this long period, the ark remained the centre of Israelite worship and the focal point of the divine presence, moving when the cloud moved and resting when the cloud rested, carried from encampment to encampment across the vast expanse of the Sinai wilderness. The book of Numbers records that when the ark set out, Moses would say, "Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And when it rested, he would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." These invocations suggest that the ark was understood not merely as a sacred container, but as the throne of the divine warrior who led his people into battle against their enemies, a conception that would become increasingly prominent as the Israelites approached the land of Canaan and prepared for the conquest that lay ahead. The book of Joshua opens with the death of Moses on the heights of Mount Nebo, overlooking the promised land that he was permitted to see but forbidden to enter as a consequence of his own moment of disobedience years earlier, and the mantle of leadership passed to Joshua, the son of Nun, who had served as Moses' lieutenant throughout the wilderness years and who now stood ready to lead the new generation across the Jordan River and into the land that God had sworn to their ancestors. The first great test of Joshua's leadership and of the power of the ark would come at the Jordan itself, for the river was in flood at the time of the crossing, swollen with the spring runoff from the mountains of Lebanon, and presenting a formidable barrier to an army encumbered with women, children, livestock, and all the material possessions of a people who had lived as nomads for 40 years. Joshua's instructions to the people echoed the events of the Exodus from Egypt, when the sea had parted before the people at the command of Moses, for he commanded the priests who carried the ark to advance into the waters of the Jordan, trusting that the same God who had divided the sea would now divide the river and open a path for his people into their inheritance. The narrative of the crossing preserved in the book of Joshua describes how the priests carrying the ark stepped into the edge of the Jordan and stood still while the waters upstream piled up in a heap and the waters downstream drained away toward the Dead Sea, leaving a dry riverbed across which the entire nation passed in a single day. The ark remained stationary in the midst of the Jordan throughout the crossing, carried by the priests who stood firm on the dry ground while more than 1 million people, according to the biblical numbers, streamed past them onto the western bank, entering the promised land through a corridor of divine power created by the presence of the ark. When the last of the Israelites had crossed, the priests carried the ark up out of the riverbed, and immediately the waters of the Jordan returned to their normal flow, cutting off any possibility of retreat and sealing the people's commitment to the conquest that lay ahead. 12 stones were taken from the riverbed where the priests had stood and set up as a memorial at Gilgal, the first encampment in the Promised Land, so that future generations might ask about their meaning and be told the story of how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the Ark of the Covenant until the people had crossed over. The conquest of Canaan that followed the crossing of the Jordan was punctuated by encounters that demonstrated the Ark's power as a weapon of holy war, and none was more dramatic than the fall of Jericho, the ancient walled city that guarded the approaches to the central hill country, and represented the first major obstacle to the Israelite advance. The fortifications of Jericho were massive by the standards of the Late Bronze Age, with walls that archaeological excavation has shown to be both tall and thick, protected by towers and designed to withstand the siege techniques of the era. The Israelites possessed no sophisticated siege equipment, no battering rams or siege towers, and their military experience consisted largely of the guerrilla encounters of the wilderness years and the campaigns against the Amorite kingdoms east of the Jordan. Yet the divine strategy communicated to Joshua for the conquest of Jericho relied not upon conventional military technique, but upon the power of the ark and the ritual procession that would accompany it around the doomed city. For 6 days, the Israelite army marched around the walls of Jericho once each day, preceded by 7 priests blowing trumpets of ram's horn, and followed by the Ark of the Covenant carried by its designated bearers. The armed men went before the priests and the rearguard followed after the ark, but the people were commanded to maintain absolute silence throughout the procession, forbidden to utter any sound until the moment when Joshua would command them to shout. The psychological effect upon the defenders of Jericho must have been profound, for they watched day after day as this strange procession circled their walls in utter silence, except for the eerie blasting of the ram's horn trumpets, knowing that within the golden chest at the heart of the procession dwelt the presence of the God who had devastated Egypt with plagues and divided the Jordan River with a word. On the 7th day, the procession circled the city not once but 7 times, and at the 7th circuit, at Joshua's command, the priests blew a long blast on their trumpets, and the entire assembly raised a great shout, and the walls of Jericho collapsed before them, allowing the Israelite warriors to charge straight into the city and devote it to destruction, according to the laws of holy war. The narrative of the conquest proceeds through subsequent campaigns in which the ark played a central role, its presence with the army ensuring divine favour and military success, while its absence or improper handling brought disaster. The defeated eye that followed the triumph at Jericho occurred because one man named Achan had violated the ban on taking plunder from Jericho, secreting beneath his tent a beautiful cloak from Shinar, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, and this transgression had broken the covenant relationship that gave the ark its power and left the army vulnerable to defeat. Only after Achan's sin had been discovered and punished by the execution of himself and his entire family, along with the destruction of all his possessions, was the covenant relationship restored and the campaign able to proceed successfully. The book of Joshua records that, at the conclusion of the initial conquest, when Joshua gathered all the tribes at Shechem to renew the covenant between God and Israel, the ark was present as the symbol and guarantee of that covenant, the tangible reminder that God had chosen this people and would remain among them so long as they remained faithful to him. The period that followed the conquest, the era of the judges, saw the ark installed at various locations throughout the Promised Land as circumstances dictated, though its primary home appears to have been at Shiloh, a site in the territory of Ephraim, where a more permanent tabernacle was constructed to house the sacred object. Shiloh became the central sanctuary of the Israelite tribal confederation during this period, the place where the tribes gathered for festivals and where disputes between tribes were adjudicated before the Lord. The high priest Eli served at Shiloh throughout his long life, and it was there that the young Samuel was dedicated to divine service by his mother Hannah and grew up in the presence of the ark, sleeping in the tabernacle near the sacred object and eventually receiving the prophetic call that would make him the last and greatest of the judges. Yet the ark's tenure at Shiloh would come to a disastrous end in the 11th century before the Common Era, when the Israelites faced a crisis that would test the limits of the ark's power and reveal the dangers of treating the sacred object as a talisman rather than as the throne of a holy God whose presence demanded moral purity from his people. The Philistines, one of the sea peoples who had migrated to the coastal plain of Canaan from the Aegean world during the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilizations, had established themselves in a pentapolis of 5 great cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, and from this base they had begun to expand inland, threatening the Israelite settlements in the hill country and the Shephelah, the lowland region between the coastal plain and the central highlands. The battle that would decide the fate of the ark took place at a site called Ebenezer, where the Israelite army had assembled to face the Philistine host, and the first day's fighting went badly for the Israelites, who lost about 4,000 men in the initial engagement and were forced to fall back to their camp. The elders of Israel, seeking to understand why the Lord had allowed such a defeat, determined that the presence of the ark would ensure divine favour in the next engagement, and they sent to Shiloh, requesting that the Ark of the Covenant be brought to the battlefield. The 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, who served as priests at Shiloh, despite their notorious corruption and impiety, accompanied the ark to the Israelite camp, and when it arrived, the entire army raised such a shout that the earth resounded. The Philistines heard the noise and learned that the ark of the God of Israel had come into the camp, and they were struck with fear, saying, "Gods have come into the camp. Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness." Yet despite their fear, the Philistine commanders rallied their troops, exhorting them to take courage and fight like men lest they become slaves to the Hebrews, as the Hebrews had been slaves to them, and the ensuing battle was catastrophic for Israel. 30,000 Israelite foot soldiers fell that day, Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, who carried it in triumph back to Ashdod, the city of their god Dagon. The capture of the Ark was a trauma so profound that it reshaped the religious and political landscape of Israel for generations to come. When the news reached Shiloh, the aged Eli, sitting by the road watching for word of the battle, fell backward from his seat at the mention of the Ark's capture and broke his neck, dying at the age of 98 after serving as judge of Israel for 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, went into labour when she heard the news of the Ark's capture and her husband's death, and as she lay dying in childbirth, she named her son Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the Ark of God has been captured." The shrine at Shiloh appears to have been destroyed either during this battle or in its aftermath, for it is never mentioned again as a functioning sanctuary, and the prophet Jeremiah would later invoke its destruction as a warning to the people of Jerusalem that even the temple they trusted in could be destroyed if they continued in their wickedness. Yet the God of Israel had not abandoned his ark to the Philistines, and the months that followed its capture became a demonstration of divine power that would convince the Philistines themselves that this object could not be held by those who were not his people. The ark was installed in the temple of Dagon at Ashdod, placed as a trophy before the great idol of the Philistine deity. But the next morning the people of Ashdod found that the statue of Dagon had fallen face downward before the ark, as if in prostration, and when they restored the idol to its place the following morning saw it fallen again, this time with its head and hands broken off and lying on the threshold of the temple, leaving only the trunk of the statue intact. This humiliation of their god was accompanied by a devastating plague that struck the city of Ashdod and its surrounding territory, an affliction described in the Hebrew text as tumours or swellings that may have been the buboes characteristic of bubonic plague, and the Ashdodites determined that the ark could not remain among them. The ark was sent to Gath, but the same plague broke out there, and from Gath it was sent to Ekron, where the people cried out in terror at its arrival, saying, "They have brought the ark of the God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people." Throughout the Philistine Pentapolis, the hand of the God of Israel was heavy upon the people, and there was a great panic as mice swarmed across the land, and the plague continued to devastate the population. After 7 months, the Philistine priests and diviners counselled that the ark must be returned to the Israelites, along with a guilt offering to appease the god whose presence had brought such devastation upon them. The offering was to consist of 5 golden tumours and 5 golden mice, representing the 5 lords of the Philistine cities and the afflictions that had struck them, and the ark was to be placed upon a new cart drawn by 2 cows that had recently calved and had never been yoked, whose calves were to be taken away from them and penned up at home. The test, the Philistine diviners explained, would determine whether the disasters had truly been caused by the God of Israel or had merely been coincidence. For if the cows went straight toward the Israelite border, despite their natural instinct to turn back toward their lowing calves, it would prove that the God of Israel had struck the Philistines. But if they did not, then the Philistines would know that it had not been his hand that had afflicted them. The cows were yoked to the cart. The golden offerings were placed in a box beside the ark, and the animals set out directly toward Beth Shemesh, on the Israelite frontier, lowing as they went but never turning aside to the right or to the left, while the Philistine lords followed at a distance to observe the outcome of their experiment. The ark's arrival at Beth Shemesh, a Levitical city in the territory of Judah, was greeted with joy by the Israelites of that region, who were harvesting wheat in the valley when the cart appeared on the road from Philistia. The Levites of the city took down the ark and the box containing the golden offerings, and placed them upon a large stone in the field of a man named Joshua, and the cows that had drawn the cart were sacrificed as a burnt offering to the Lord, using the wood of the cart itself as fuel. Yet the celebration of the ark's return was marred by a tragedy that reinforced the lesson of the object's dangerous holiness, for some of the men of Beth Shemesh looked upon the ark, or according to an alternative reading of the text looked into it, and were struck dead for their presumption, 70 men according to one textual tradition, or 50,070 according to another, numbers that scholars have debated but which in either case indicated that improper contact with the ark remained as deadly as it had been in the wilderness. The people of Beth Shemesh, frightened by this manifestation of divine power, sent messengers to the town of Kiriath Jearim, asking them to come and take the ark away, and it was there, in the house of a man named Abinadab on a hill outside the town, that the ark would remain for the next 20 years, tended by Abinadab's son Eleazar, who was consecrated for this purpose, waiting for the emergence of a king who would bring it at last to its proper resting place, at the heart of the nation. The 20 years during which the Ark of the Covenant remained in the house of Abinadab at Kiriath Jearim coincided with some of the most turbulent and transformative decades in the history of ancient Israel, a period that would see the nation transition from a loose confederation of tribes governed by charismatic judges to a centralized monarchy under the rule of kings. The prophet Samuel, who had been ministering at the sanctuary of Shiloh when the ark was captured by the Philistines, and whose mother Hannah had dedicated him to the service of the Lord before his birth, continued to serve as the spiritual leader of Israel throughout this period, travelling in a circuit between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah to judge the people and offer sacrifices on their behalf. Yet Samuel's authority was increasingly challenged by the demands of the Israelite elders, who observed that the prophet was growing old and that his sons, whom he had appointed as judges in his place, were corrupt men who accepted bribes and perverted justice. The elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at his home in Ramah with a request that would fundamentally alter the political structure of the nation, asking him to appoint for them a king to govern them, like all the other nations of the ancient Near East. Samuel was displeased by this request, understanding it as a rejection not merely of his own leadership, but of the direct kingship of the Lord over Israel. Yet when he brought the matter before the Lord in prayer, he was told to listen to the voice of the people and to give them a king, though he was also instructed to warn them solemnly of what the behaviour of a king would be, how he would take their sons for his chariots and cavalry, their daughters for perfumers and cooks, their fields and vineyards and olive orchards for his own servants, a tenth of their grain, and their flocks for his officers and officials, until they would cry out because of their king, but the Lord would not answer them on that day. The first king whom Samuel anointed over Israel was Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, a tall and handsome young man who stood head and shoulders above all the other people of the land, chosen by the Lord and designated through a series of signs and confirmations that included prophetic ecstasy and the casting of sacred lots. Saul's early reign was marked by military success against the enemies of Israel, including a decisive victory over the Ammonites who had besieged the city of Jabesh-Gilead, and for a time the new monarchy seemed to fulfill the hopes of those who had demanded it. Yet Saul's relationship with Samuel deteriorated rapidly over matters of ritual authority and obedience to prophetic instruction, and within a few years of his coronation the prophet had informed him that the Lord had rejected him as king and would give the kingdom to another, a man after the Lord's own heart who would do all that the Lord commanded him. Throughout the turmoil of Saul's reign, the Ark of the Covenant remained in obscurity at Kiriath-Jearim, playing no recorded role in the military campaigns or religious observances of the nation, a situation that stood in marked contrast to the Ark's prominent place in the wilderness wanderings and the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. Whether this neglect of the Ark reflected a general decline in Israelite religious practice during the period of the Judges, or whether it indicated a deliberate distancing from the object that had brought such devastation upon Beth Shemesh, or whether it simply resulted from the ongoing Philistine threat that made any movement of the Ark toward a more central location too dangerous to attempt, the biblical text does not make explicit. What the narrative does make clear is that the restoration of the Ark to a place of honour at the centre of Israelite worship would become one of the defining achievements of Saul's successor, the young shepherd and warrior who would become the greatest king in the history of Israel and the founder of a dynasty that would endure for more than 4 centuries. David, son of Jesse, was a native of Bethlehem in the territory of Judah, the youngest of 8 brothers who tended his father's flocks in the hill country south of Jerusalem, while his older brothers served in Saul's army. He first came to national prominence through his victory over the Philistine champion Goliath in the valley of Elah, a feat of courage and faith that brought him into the household of the king as a warrior, musician, and companion to the crown prince Jonathan. The relationship between David and Saul deteriorated over the following years as the young man's military successes and growing popularity aroused the king's jealousy and paranoid suspicion, leading to a prolonged period during which David lived as a fugitive and outlaw in the wilderness regions of Judah and among the Philistines themselves, gathering around him a band of disaffected and desperate men who would form the nucleus of his future army. After Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, David was anointed king over the tribe of Judah at Hebron, and following a period of civil war with the remaining supporters of Saul's house, he was accepted as king over all the tribes of Israel, unifying the nation under a single crown for the first time in its history. One of David's earliest and most strategically significant actions as king of the united monarchy was the capture of Jerusalem, a Canaanite stronghold that had never been conquered by the Israelites and that occupied a position on the border between the territories of Judah and Benjamin, making it an ideal capital for a kingdom that needed to transcend the old tribal divisions. David conquered the city by sending his men through its water shaft to take the Jebusite defenders by surprise, and he established there his royal palace and administrative centre, transforming Jerusalem from an obscure fortress into the political heart of Israel. Yet David understood that political centralization alone would not be sufficient to unite the tribes, and that Jerusalem needed to become not only the seat of royal power, but also the religious centre of the nation, the place where the presence of the Lord would dwell among his people. For this purpose he determined to bring the Ark of the Covenant from its long exile at Kiriath-Jearim to its new home in the city of David. The transfer of the Ark to Jerusalem was conceived and executed as one of the most magnificent religious ceremonies in the history of ancient Israel, a national celebration that would mark the convergence of political and spiritual authority in the person of the king and in his newly chosen capital. David assembled 30,000 chosen men from all the tribes of Israel to accompany him to Kiriath-Jearim, a vast procession that reflected the importance of the occasion and the king's desire to involve the entire nation in the religious event that would establish Jerusalem's sacred significance. The ark was brought out from the house of Abinadab on the hill, and placed upon a new cart, recalling the manner in which the Philistines had returned it from their territory, but departing from the precedent established in the wilderness period, when the ark had always been carried by Levitical priests using the gilded poles that passed through its golden rings. Abinadab's sons Uzzah and Ahio accompanied the cart, Uzzah walking beside it, and Ahio going before it to guide its progress, while David and all the house of Israel celebrated before the Lord with all manner of instruments, with lyres and harps and tambourines, with sistrums and cymbals, with songs and shouts of joy that filled the road from Kiriath-Jearim to Jerusalem. The atmosphere was one of jubilant celebration, a moment of national unity and religious devotion that seemed to inaugurate a new era in the relationship between the Lord and his chosen people. Yet the joyful procession was interrupted by a tragedy that recalled the ancient terror of the ark's presence and demonstrated that even the greatest king in Israel could not approach the divine presence without consequence. When the procession reached the threshing floor of a man named Nacon, the oxen drawing the cart stumbled, and Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark and prevent it from falling. At the moment of contact, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he was struck dead beside the ark for his irreverence, dying on the spot in the midst of what had been a celebration of national joy. The reaction of David to this catastrophe was complex and revealing of the tensions inherent in the Israelite relationship with their God. The text records that David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah, and he named that place Perez Uzzah, meaning the outburst against Uzzah, a name that would preserve the memory of the event for future generations. But the king's anger was quickly succeeded by fear, and he asked himself how he could possibly bring the ark of the Lord into his care when its very presence had proved so dangerous. Rather than continuing the procession to Jerusalem, David diverted the ark to the house of a man named Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it would remain for 3 months while the king considered what to do. The 3 months during which the ark resided with Obed-Edom demonstrated that the presence of the Lord brought blessing as well as judgment, for the text records that the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household during this period, suggesting that proper reverence toward the ark resulted in divine favour rather than divine wrath. When David learned that the household of Obed-Edom had been blessed because of the presence of the ark, his fear gave way to renewed determination, and he organised a second procession to bring the ark into Jerusalem, this time with careful attention to the ritual requirements that had been violated in the first attempt. The ark was carried by Levitical priests rather than being placed on a cart, and after the bearers had gone 6 paces without incident, David sacrificed an ox and a fatted calf as a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, establishing a pattern of sacrifice that would continue throughout the remainder of the journey. The king himself participated in the celebration in a manner that scandalized some observers and that has remained one of the most discussed episodes in his biography, for David stripped off his royal robes and danced before the Lord wearing only a linen ephod, the simple garment of a priest, leaping and whirling with all his might as the ark was carried through the streets of Jerusalem accompanied by shouting and the sound of the ram's horn. Michal, the daughter of Saul, who had been given to David as a wife in his youth, and who watched the procession from a window of the palace, despised her husband in her heart when she saw the king of Israel exposing himself before the servant girls of his household like any vulgar fellow, and when she confronted him afterward with her contempt, David replied that he had been dancing before the Lord who had chosen him above her father and above all his house to appoint him as prince over Israel, and that he would make himself even more contemptible than this, and humble himself in his own eyes, but by the servant girls of whom she had spoken he would be held in honour. The text notes that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death, a detail that later readers understood as divine judgment upon her contempt for David's religious devotion. The ark was brought into the city of David and placed inside a tent that the king had pitched for it, a temporary sanctuary that recalled the portable tabernacle of the wilderness period, and that would serve as the dwelling place of the divine presence until a permanent temple could be constructed. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord, and when he had finished making these sacrifices, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed to the entire assembly of Israel, both men and women, a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to every person, after which the people departed to their homes, and the king went to bless his own household. The establishment of the Ark in Jerusalem marked a watershed moment in the religious history of Israel, for it transformed David's political capital into a sacred city, the place where the God of Israel had chosen to make his presence known among his people. The theological implications of this development would be elaborated over the following centuries by prophets and psalmists, who celebrated Zion as the mountain of the Lord's holiness, the place he had chosen for his habitation forever, the city whose foundations were in the holy mountains, and which the Lord loved more than all the dwellings of Jacob. The Davidic covenant, established through the prophet Nathan shortly after the ark's arrival in Jerusalem, promised that David's descendants would reign on his throne forever, and that a son of David would build a house for the name of the Lord, linking the royal dynasty to the sanctuary in a bond that would define Judean religious and political identity for centuries to come. The house that David wished to build for the ark would not be constructed during his own lifetime, for the Lord informed him through Nathan the prophet that because David had shed much blood and had waged great wars, he would not be permitted to build a house for the divine name, but that his son who would be born to him would be a man of rest, and the Lord would give him rest from all his enemies on every side, and he would build the house. This son was Solomon, born to David by Bathsheba, the former wife of Uriah the Hittite, whose conception had been the result of David's adultery, and whose birth had followed the death of the child conceived in sin, a sequence of events that had brought divine judgment upon David's house, even as it produced the heir who would fulfill the promise of the Davidic covenant. David spent the final years of his reign accumulating the materials and resources that Solomon would need for the construction of the temple, gathering gold and silver and bronze and iron in quantities beyond weighing, cedar timber from the kings of Tyre and Sidon, and dressed stones of enormous size quarried and prepared for the foundations of the house. He organised the Levites and priests into their divisions of service, appointed singers and musicians for the worship that would take place in the temple courts, and provided his son with detailed plans for every aspect of the sanctuary, including the pattern for the inner chamber where the ark would rest, plans which according to the chronicler had been given to David by the hand of the Lord, who had made him understand all the work to be done. When David died after a reign of 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 years in Jerusalem, Solomon ascended to the throne of his father, and immediately began the great work that would occupy the first 11 years of his reign, and would produce the most magnificent structure in the history of ancient Israel. The construction of Solomon's temple was an undertaking of extraordinary ambition and complexity, requiring the coordinated efforts of tens of thousands of workers over more than a decade and the importation of materials from distant regions that Israel could not produce for itself. The foundation was laid in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, 480 years after the exodus from Egypt according to the biblical chronology, in the month of Ziv, which corresponds to the late spring of the agricultural calendar. The temple itself was built of massive blocks of dressed stone quarried and shaped at the extraction site so that no sound of hammer or axe or any iron tool would be heard at the construction location, a requirement that reflected the ancient prohibition against the use of iron implements in sacred construction, and that lent an atmosphere of reverent silence to the building process. The interior was lined entirely with cedar boards from Lebanon, carved with gourds and open flowers, and the floor was covered with planks of cypress wood, so that no stone was visible inside the completed structure, but only the warm fragrance of precious timber. The entire interior was then overlaid with gold, including the floor and the walls and the ceiling, the altar of incense that stood before the inner sanctuary, and the great doors of olive wood that separated the holy place from the most holy place, transforming the dim interior of the temple into a chamber of burnished radiance that would shimmer in the light of the golden lampstands arranged along its walls. At the heart of Solomon's temple, occupying the full width of the building at its western end, was the chamber called the Deber, or most holy place, the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant would reside in perpetual darkness. This chamber was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in each dimension, a geometric form that represented perfection and completeness in ancient Near Eastern symbolism, and that would be echoed centuries later in the description of the heavenly Jerusalem in the Book of Revelation. Within this chamber, Solomon placed 2 enormous cherubim carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold, each standing 10 cubits high with wings that stretched 5 cubits on each side, so that the total wingspan of each cherub was 10 cubits, and the combined wings of the 2 figures, standing side by side, reached from wall to wall across the chamber, one wing of each cherub touching the wall, and the other wing touching the corresponding wing of its companion at the centre of the room. These cherubim were vastly larger than the golden figures that stood upon the ark's mercy seat, and they created a kind of double covering for the sacred object. The the smaller cherubim attached to the ark itself, and the massive wooden cherubim standing as guardians over the entire chamber. The Holy of Holies had no windows, and once the doors were closed it would exist in complete darkness, a fitting environment for a god who had declared that he would dwell in thick darkness, and who had manifested his presence on Mount Sinai in fire and smoke and thundercloud. The dedication of Solomon's temple and the installation of the ark within the Holy of Holies was celebrated with ceremonies that surpassed in magnificence even the procession by which David had brought the ark to Jerusalem. Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the Israelites, in Jerusalem in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month of the year corresponding to the autumn harvest festival of Sukkot, when the people traditionally gathered to celebrate the ingathering of the fruits of the land, and to commemorate the wilderness wanderings during which their ancestors had lived in temporary booths. The timing was significant, for the ark's installation in its permanent sanctuary coincided with the festival that most directly recalled the period when the ark had dwelt in the portable tabernacle, marking the transition from the wandering period to the settled prosperity of the monarchic age. The priests carried the ark from the tent where David had placed it, and brought it into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim that overshadowed the place of the ark. They brought also the tent of meeting and all the holy vessels that were in the tent, the sacred objects that had accompanied the ark through the wilderness, and that would now be preserved in the temple precincts. The account notes that when the priests withdrew from the holy place, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses had placed there at Horeb, the original covenant documents that represented the foundational agreement between the Lord and his people, confirming that the golden pot of manna and Aaron's rod that budded, which the epistle to the Hebrews would later enumerate among the contents of the ark, were either later additions to the tradition, or had been lost during the troubled centuries between the conquest and the monarchy. When the priests emerged from the holy place, after depositing the ark beneath the cherubim, a cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. This cloud was the visible manifestation of divine presence that had led the Israelites through the wilderness as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The same glory that had descended upon Mount Sinai when Moses received the tablets of the law, and that had filled the tabernacle when it was first erected in the wilderness. Its appearance at the dedication of Solomon's temple confirmed that the God of Israel had accepted this permanent sanctuary as his dwelling place, and that the temple would serve the same function as the portable tabernacle had served during the wandering years, as the meeting point between the divine and human realms, the place where sacrifices would be offered and prayers would be heard, and the presence of the living God would abide among his people. Solomon addressed the assembled nation with a speech that interpreted the significance of what had occurred, declaring that the Lord had said he would dwell in thick darkness, and that Solomon had built an exalted house for him, a place for him to dwell in forever. The king then turned toward the altar before the assembly and spread out his hands toward heaven in prayer, asking the Lord to fulfill the promises he had made to David, and to hear the prayers of his people whenever they called upon him in this house or toward this house. The dedication prayer of Solomon addressed a comprehensive range of situations in which the people of Israel might find themselves calling upon the Lord, from disputes between individuals requiring a divine oath to national catastrophes such as drought, famine, plague, and military defeat. In each case, the king asked that when the people recognized their sin and turned toward this house in repentance, the Lord would hear from heaven his dwelling place, and would forgive and act and render to each according to all his ways. The prayer acknowledged the theological paradox that the temple presented, for if the heavens and the highest heavens could not contain the God of Israel, how much less this house that Solomon had built, and yet the Lord had chosen to make his name dwell in this place, and to regard it as the focal point of his relationship with his people on earth. The prayer concluded with a petition that the Lord would maintain the cause of his people Israel as each day required, so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the Lord was God and there was no other. When Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple so that the priests could not enter the house, and all the people of Israel, seeing the fire come down, and the glory of the Lord on the temple, bowed with their faces to the ground on the pavement, and worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." The temple that Solomon built would stand for nearly 4 centuries, and throughout that long span of years the Ark of the Covenant remained within the Holy of Holies, unseen by ordinary eyes yet ever present at the heart of Israelite religious life. The high priest alone was permitted to enter that innermost sanctuary, and he did so only once each year, on the Day of Atonement, when he would pass through the veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the outer chamber, and stand in the presence of the Ark to make atonement for the sins of the nation. The rituals of that day were prescribed in elaborate detail in the book of Leviticus, requiring the high priest to bathe himself and to dress in special white garments, rather than his ordinary vestments of gold and blue and purple, to offer a bull as a sin offering for himself and his household, and then to take 2 goats provided by the congregation, one of which would be sacrificed as a sin offering for the people, while the other would be sent away into the wilderness bearing upon it all the iniquities of the children of Israel. Before entering the Holy of Holies, the high priest was to take a censer full of burning coals from the altar, and 2 handfuls of finely ground sweet incense, bringing them within the veil, and putting the incense on the fire before the Lord so that the cloud of incense would cover the mercy seat that was over the testimony, lest he die. He would then sprinkle blood from the sacrificed bull and goat upon the mercy seat and before it, making atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel and because of their transgressions in all their sins. The purpose of these elaborate rituals was to purify the sanctuary itself from the contamination that the sins of the people had caused to accumulate over the preceding year. For ancient Israelite religion conceived of sin as a kind of pollution that adhered to sacred spaces and objects, and that had to be periodically cleansed if the sanctuary was to remain fit for the presence of the Lord. The Ark of the Covenant, with its golden mercy seat, served as the focal point of this cleansing ritual, the place where the blood of atonement was applied and where the forgiveness of sins was secured for another year. The generations that followed Solomon witnessed both the continued centrality of the temple in Israelite religious life and the political upheavals that would eventually threaten its very existence. Solomon's own reign, for all its glory and prosperity, had sown the seeds of future disaster through the heavy taxation and forced labour required to complete his ambitious building projects. When Solomon died after 40 years on the throne, and his son Rehoboam succeeded him, the northern tribes of Israel gathered at Shechem to request relief from the burdens that Solomon had imposed. Rehoboam, following the advice of his younger counsellors rather than the elders who had served his father, responded with harsh words, declaring that whereas his father had disciplined the people with whips, he would discipline them with scorpions. This arrogant response provoked an immediate rebellion, and the 10 northern tribes rejected the house of David entirely, establishing their own kingdom under a man named Jeroboam, who had previously served as an administrator in Solomon's labour force. The unified kingdom that David had established and Solomon had enriched was thus torn in 2, with the larger and more prosperous northern kingdom taking the name Israel, while the smaller southern kingdom, consisting only of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, retained the Davidic dynasty and continued to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. The division of the kingdom created an immediate religious problem for Jeroboam, the new king of the northern tribes. If his subjects continued to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year to observe the great pilgrimage festivals at Solomon's temple, their political loyalty might gradually shift back toward the house of David, and the newly independent northern kingdom might be reabsorbed into the Davidic state. To prevent this outcome, Jeroboam established 2 alternative worship sites within his own territory, one at Dan in the far north near the sources of the Jordan River, and another at Bethel on the southern border of his kingdom, a site that already possessed ancient religious associations dating back to the patriarch Jacob. At each of these sanctuaries, Jeroboam placed a golden calf, telling the people that these were the gods that had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, and that they need no longer make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This act would be remembered in the biblical tradition as the great sin of Jeroboam, the departure from true worship that set the northern kingdom on a path of religious apostasy from which it would never recover. The golden calves were almost certainly intended not as representations of rival deities but as throne platforms or pedestals upon which the invisible God of Israel was understood to sit, much as the cherubim of the ark served as a throne for the invisible presence of the Lord in the Jerusalem temple. But the biblical writers condemn the calves as idolatrous, regardless of the theological reasoning behind them, and the northern kingdom's religious legitimacy was permanently compromised in the eyes of the Judean historians who preserved the scriptural record. For the next 2 centuries, the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judah existed side by side, sometimes at war with each other, sometimes allied against common enemies, while the Ark of the Covenant remained in the Temple at Jerusalem as the supreme symbol of the Lord's continuing presence with the Davidic dynasty and the people of Judah. The biblical account of this period, preserved in the books of Kings and Chronicles, focuses heavily on the religious faithfulness or unfaithfulness of the various monarchs who succeeded one another on the thrones of the two kingdoms, measuring each king against the standard of David's devotion to the Lord and condemning those who permitted or encouraged the worship of foreign gods. The northern kingdom is depicted as perpetually rebellious against the true worship of the Lord, maintaining the golden calves that Jeroboam had established and frequently adopting the religious practices of its Canaanite and Phoenician neighbours. The southern kingdom of Judah is presented in more mixed terms, with some kings receiving praise for their faithfulness, while others are condemned for their apostasy. But throughout this period, the temple in Jerusalem and the ark within it remained the legitimate centre of worship for the God of Israel. The first major crisis in the security of the temple came just 5 years after the death of Solomon and the division of the kingdom, when an Egyptian pharaoh named Shishak invaded the land of Judah during the reign of Rehoboam. The Book of Kings records that Shishak came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, carrying off everything, including the golden shields that Solomon had made. This brief notice has occasioned much speculation among later readers about whether the treasures taken by Shishak might have included the Ark of the Covenant itself. An Egyptian inscription at the Temple of Karnak records a campaign by the pharaoh Sheshonq-Thiamar, whom scholars identify with the biblical Shishak, listing numerous towns in both Israel and Judah that were conquered or plundered during this expedition, though the inscription does not specifically mention Jerusalem or any sacred objects taken from the temple. The biblical text makes no mention of the ark being carried away by the Egyptians, focusing instead on the golden shields, and the subsequent narrative continues to assume that the ark remained in the Holy of Holies throughout the following centuries. Nevertheless, the possibility that the ark was removed to Egypt during this early raid has attracted adherents among those who seek to trace the subsequent whereabouts of the lost ark, though no Egyptian source has ever confirmed the presence of the Israelite ark among the treasures of any pharaoh. The centuries that followed the reign of Rehoboam witnessed numerous occasions on which the treasures of the Jerusalem temple were depleted to pay tribute to foreign powers or to secure military alliances. When King Asa of Judah sought help from the Aramean kingdom of Damascus against an invasion by the northern kingdom of Israel, he sent silver and gold from the treasuries of the temple and the royal palace as payment for the alliance. When King Jehoash of Israel besieged Jerusalem and broke down a portion of its walls during a conflict with the southern kingdom, he took all the gold and silver and all the vessels that were found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, though again no mention is made of the ark being among the plunder. When King Ahaz of Judah faced an invasion by the combined forces of Israel and Damascus, he stripped silver and gold from the temple to send as tribute to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, purchasing Assyrian intervention against his enemies. Each of these episodes reduced the accumulated wealth of the temple and demonstrated the vulnerability of the sanctuary to the pressures of international politics. Yet the ark itself appears to have remained untouched throughout these various depredations, protected by its sacred status and by the fear that surrounded any contact with so holy an object. The northern kingdom of Israel came to its end in the year 722 before the Common Era, when the Assyrian army under King Shalmaneser V and his successor Sargon II conquered its capital city of Samaria after a siege of 3 years, and deported the population to distant regions of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians brought in colonists from other conquered territories to settle the depopulated land, and these newcomers intermarried with the remaining Israelite population to produce the people known in later centuries as the Samaritans, who would be regarded by the Jews of Judah as religiously illegitimate and ethnically impure. The destruction of the northern kingdom left Judah as the sole surviving Israelite state, a small vassal kingdom surrounded by the vast Assyrian Empire and clinging to its independence through a combination of careful diplomacy and occasional rebellion. The temple in Jerusalem and the ark within it now represented not merely the religious centre of the southern kingdom, but the last surviving sanctuary of the God of Israel, the final repository of the covenant relationship that had once united all 12 tribes under the worship of the one true God. The century and a half that followed the fall of the northern kingdom witnessed a religious revival in Judah under the reforming kings Hezekiah and Josiah, both of whom are celebrated in the biblical record for their efforts to purify the worship of the Lord and to eliminate the foreign religious practices that had infiltrated the temple and the land. Hezekiah, who reigned during the height of Assyrian power, removed the high places where sacrifice had been offered outside of Jerusalem, broke down the sacred pillars associated with Canaanite worship, and destroyed a bronze serpent that Moses was said to have made in the wilderness, and that had become an object of worship among the people. The Book of Chronicles credits Hezekiah with reopening the doors of the temple, which had apparently been closed during the reign of his unfaithful father Ahaz, and with ordering the Levites to sanctify themselves and the house of the Lord. Hezekiah's reforms were interrupted by the Assyrian crisis that occurred in the 14th year of his reign, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah, captured numerous fortified cities, and besieged Jerusalem itself, demanding the surrender of Hezekiah and the payment of an enormous tribute. Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors and doorposts of the temple to pay this tribute, but the siege was eventually lifted without the capture of Jerusalem, a deliverance that the biblical writers attributed to the direct intervention of the Lord, who sent an angel that struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. A century later, the young King Josiah undertook an even more thorough program of religious reform, prompted by the discovery of what the Book of Kings calls the Book of the Law, during repairs to the temple. Scholars have long debated the identity of this book, with many suggesting that it was an early form of the Book of Deuteronomy, which calls for the centralization of worship at a single sanctuary chosen by the Lord and condemns the worship practices that Josiah proceeded to abolish throughout the land. When the book was read before Josiah, he tore his clothes in grief and alarm at the realization of how far his kingdom had departed from the requirements of the covenant, and he immediately embarked on a comprehensive program of reform. He removed from the temple all the vessels made for Baal and Asherah and the host of heaven, burning them outside the city in the fields of the Kidron Valley. He deposed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings at the high places throughout the land and in the cities surrounding Jerusalem. He desecrated the high places that Solomon had built for the foreign gods, worshipped by his foreign wives, including the shrines to Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, Molech the abomination of the Ammonites, and Ashtoreth the abomination of the Sidonians. He even extended his reforms into the territory of the former northern kingdom, desecrating the altar at Bethel that Jeroboam had established and burning the bones of the dead priests who had served there upon its ruins. The reforms of Josiah represented the high water mark of religious faithfulness in the biblical narrative of the Judean monarchy, a moment when the worship of the Lord at the Jerusalem temple achieved a purity and centralization that it had never possessed before and would never achieve again. The Ark of the Covenant, which had remained within the Holy of Holies throughout the preceding centuries, continued to serve as the focal point of this purified worship, the place where the presence of the Lord dwelt among his people, and where the high priest made atonement for their sins on the Day of Atonement. A single verse in the Book of Chronicles, in its account of Josiah's reforms, contains a curious reference to the ark that has puzzled interpreters for centuries. During the preparations for the great Passover celebration that concluded Josiah's reform, the king instructed the Levites who taught all Israel and who were holy to the Lord to put the holy ark in the house that Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built, saying that they need no longer carry it on their shoulders, but should now serve the Lord their God and his people Israel. This instruction implies that the ark had been removed from the Holy of Holies at some point before Josiah's reign, perhaps during the apostasy of his grandfather Manasseh or his father Amon, and that Josiah was ordering its restoration to its proper place in the innermost sanctuary of the temple. If this interpretation is correct, it indicates that the ark survived the troubled decades of the 7th century and was still present in the temple at the time of Josiah's reforms, a fact that would narrow the possible window for its disappearance to the final years before the Babylonian destruction. The reforms of Josiah came to an abrupt end in the year 609 before the Common Era, when the king marched out to intercept an Egyptian army passing through his territory on its way to support the collapsing Assyrian Empire against the rising power of Babylon. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho-Sek sent messengers to Josiah warning him not to interfere, claiming that God had commanded him to make haste and that Josiah should refrain from opposing God who was with him, lest God destroy him. Josiah refused to listen and engaged the Egyptian forces at the pass of Megiddo, where he was struck by an arrow and died of his wounds. His death was mourned throughout Judah as a catastrophe of the highest order, and the prophet Jeremiah is said to have composed laments for the fallen king that were recited for many years afterward. With Josiah's death, the religious reforms he had implemented quickly unravelled, and the remaining kings of Judah returned to the syncretistic practices that had characterized earlier generations, worshipping foreign gods alongside the Lord and allowing the temple worship to become contaminated with practices that the prophets condemned as abominations. The political situation of Judah deteriorated rapidly in the decades following Josiah's death, as the kingdom found itself caught between the competing empires of Egypt and Babylon. Josiah's son Jehoahaz reigned for only 3 months before being deposed by Pharaoh Necho, who placed another of Josiah's sons on the throne under the name Jehoiakim and imposed a heavy tribute on the land. Jehoiakim proved to be an unfaithful king in the biblical assessment, doing evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done, and during his reign the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar II emerged as the dominant power in the region, defeating the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 and claiming sovereignty over all the lands that had previously been subject to either Assyria or Egypt. Judah became a vassal of Babylon, but after 3 years Jehoiakim rebelled, withholding the tribute he owed to Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian response was swift and devastating, though Jehoiakim himself died before the full consequences of his rebellion could be visited upon him, leaving his son Jehoiakim to face the wrath of Babylon. In the year 597 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar's army besieged Jerusalem, and after a brief resistance Jehoiakim surrendered himself, his mother, his servants, his officials, and his palace attendants to the Babylonian king. Nebuchadnezzar carried away to Babylon all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord that Solomon king of Israel had made, as the Lord had foretold. He also carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials and all the mighty men of valour, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths, leaving behind only the poorest people of the land. Among those deported to Babylon was the young king Jehoiakim himself, along with the prophet Ezekiel, who would compose his prophetic visions in exile by the waters of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar placed yet another son of Josiah on the throne of Judah, a man named Mattaniah, whom he renamed Zedekiah, installing him as a puppet king over the diminished remnant of the Judean state. The temple treasures carried away in this first Babylonian deportation of 597 did not include the Ark of the Covenant as far as the biblical record indicates. The vessels of gold that were cut in pieces appear to have been the golden furnishings of the outer chamber and the courts of the temple rather than the sacred ark that dwelt within the Holy of Holies. The ark remained in its place behind the veil, guarded by the cherubim that Solomon had constructed, continuing to serve as the throne of the invisible God and the focal point of the covenant relationship even as the kingdom collapsed around it, and its people were carried away into exile. But the respite was brief, for Zedekiah, despite having sworn an oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, eventually rebelled against Babylon in alliance with Egypt, bringing upon himself and his kingdom the final catastrophe that would end the Judean state and destroy the Temple of Solomon forever. The rebellion of Zedekiah against Babylon unfolded over a period of approximately 3 years, from roughly 589 to 586 before the Common Era, and the consequences of this decision would prove to be among the most catastrophic in the entire history of ancient Israel. The motivations behind Zedekiah's rebellion appear to have been complex, involving both the encouragement of a faction within the Judean court that favoured alliance with Egypt and the king's own reluctance to accept the permanent subordination of his kingdom to a foreign power. The prophet Jeremiah, who was active throughout this period, and whose oracles have been preserved in the book that bears his name, counselled repeatedly against rebellion, warning that Babylon was the instrument of divine judgment, and that resistance would only result in greater destruction. Jeremiah's message was deeply unpopular with the royal court, and with the patriotic faction that believed Judah could successfully resist Babylonian domination with Egyptian support, and the prophet was at various times imprisoned, thrown into a muddy cistern, and threatened with execution for what was seen as demoralizing and treasonous speech. Nevertheless, Zedekiah appears to have consulted Jeremiah privately on multiple occasions, seeking to know whether the Lord had any word of hope for the beleaguered kingdom, and each time the prophet's answer remained the same: surrender to Babylon and live, or resist and perish. The Egyptian alliance that Zedekiah was counting upon proved to be unreliable, as Egyptian military assistance had proven unreliable throughout the entire history of Judah's dealings with that ancient kingdom to the south. When Nebuchadnezzar's army arrived to besiege Jerusalem in response to Zedekiah's rebellion, an Egyptian force did march northward to provide relief, and the Babylonians temporarily lifted their siege to confront this new threat. The people of Jerusalem briefly hoped that deliverance had come, but Jeremiah warned them that the Egyptians would return to their own land without accomplishing anything, and that the Babylonians would resume their siege and complete the destruction of the city. This prophecy proved accurate as the Egyptian expedition withdrew without engaging the Babylonian army in any decisive battle, leaving Jerusalem to face the full weight of Nebuchadnezzar's wrath alone. The siege of Jerusalem that began in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign and continued for approximately 18 months was among the most terrible ordeals that any city in the ancient world could endure. The Babylonian army constructed siege works around the city, cutting off all supplies of food and water and preventing any escape. The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to the prophet Jeremiah, provides a harrowing account of the conditions within the besieged city, describing how mothers boiled and ate their own children for food, how the nobles who had once worn fine linen picked through garbage heaps searching for scraps, how the young and the old alike lay dying in the streets while no one could provide relief or even proper burial. The famine became so severe that, according to the biblical account, there was no bread for the people of the land, and the defenders of the city grew weaker with each passing month, while the Babylonian besiegers maintained their positions with supplies brought from their empire's abundant resources. The end came in the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, in the 4th month of that year, when the Babylonians finally breached the walls of Jerusalem. The exact date is recorded in the biblical text with unusual precision, indicating that the fall of Jerusalem was remembered as one of the defining moments of Israelite history, a catastrophe whose anniversary would be observed with fasting and mourning for generations afterward. When the breach occurred, Zedekiah and his soldiers attempted to escape the city under cover of darkness, fleeing by way of the king's garden through a gate between the two walls, hoping to reach safety in the wilderness of the Jordan Valley. The Babylonian army pursued and overtook the fleeing king in the plains of Jericho, near the very place where the Israelites had first entered the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership centuries before. The soldiers of Zedekiah scattered and abandoned their king, and he was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at his field headquarters at Riblah in the land of Hamath, far to the north of Jerusalem. The punishment inflicted upon Zedekiah was designed to serve as an example to all who might contemplate rebellion against Babylonian authority, and to ensure that the defeated king would never again be capable of leading resistance. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the execution of Zedekiah's sons before his eyes, so that the last sight the king of Judah would ever behold would be the death of his dynasty and the extinguishing of his royal line. After witnessing this horror, Zedekiah was blinded, bound in bronze chains, and carried away to Babylon, where he would spend the remainder of his days as a prisoner, living testimony to the consequences of defying the power of the Babylonian Empire. The fate of Zedekiah fulfilled a paradoxical prophecy that Ezekiel had uttered concerning him, saying that he would be brought to Babylon but would not see it, a prediction that had seemed contradictory until its terrible fulfillment through the blinding that preceded his deportation. In the 5th month of that same year, approximately 1 month after the walls were breached and the king captured, Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's royal guard, arrived in Jerusalem to carry out the systematic destruction of the city and its sacred institutions. The biblical account provides detailed lists of what was destroyed and what was carried away, creating a record that later generations would read with mingled grief and longing. Nebuzaradan burned the house of the Lord, which is to say the Temple of Solomon that had stood for nearly 4 centuries as the dwelling place of the God of Israel. He burned the king's house, the royal palace that David and Solomon had constructed and that successive generations had maintained and expanded. He burned all the houses of Jerusalem, every great house that belonged to the nobility and the wealthy citizens who had inhabited the city. And he broke down the walls of Jerusalem all around, dismantling the fortifications that had protected the city, and rendering it defenceless against any future threat. The destruction of the temple by fire was an act of devastating finality, reducing to ashes and rubble the most sacred site in the Israelite religious world. The cedar panelling that had been brought from Lebanon at such great expense, the gold overlay that had covered the walls of the inner sanctuary, the carved cherubim and palm trees and open flowers that had adorned every surface, all were consumed in the conflagration or melted in the intense heat. The bronze pillars that had stood at the entrance to the temple, Jachin and Boaz, which Solomon had erected as symbols of the permanence and stability of the Davidic dynasty, and its covenant with God, were broken up by the Babylonians and the bronze carried away to Babylon. The great bronze sea that had stood in the court of the temple, supported by 12 bronze oxen facing the 4 cardinal directions, was likewise broken up, and its metal taken as plunder. The bases and the lavers and the utensils and all the implements of bronze that had been used in the temple service were carried away to Babylon, along with whatever vessels of gold and silver had survived the earlier deportation under Jehoiachin. The biblical text provides an extraordinarily detailed inventory of the items taken from the temple, listing the fire pans and the basins and the snuffers and the dishes for incense and the censers and the bowls and the lampstands and the cups, item by item, material by material, creating a catalogue of sacred loss that later readers would contemplate with profound sorrow. The 2 pillars, the 1 sea, and the 12 bronze oxen that were under the sea, the text specifies, along with the bases which Solomon had made for the house of the Lord, the bronze of all these vessels was beyond weight. The height of the 1 pillar was 18 cubits, and a capital of bronze was upon it, and the height of the capital was 3 cubits, with network and pomegranates upon the capital all around, all of bronze, and the 2nd pillar had the same with the network. These specifications were recorded not merely as an inventory of plunder, but as a memorial of what had been lost, a written record of sacred architecture that could never be rebuilt in exactly the same form, since the skills and resources that had produced the original were no longer available. Yet in all of this detailed accounting of temple treasures destroyed and carried away, there is no mention whatsoever of the Ark of the Covenant. This silence is perhaps the most remarkable and troubling aspect of the entire biblical account of Jerusalem's destruction, the most sacred object in all of Israelite religion, the golden chest that had accompanied the people through their wilderness wanderings and their conquest of the land and their establishment of the monarchy, the throne of the invisible God whose presence dwelt between the cherubim, simply disappears from the historical record without explanation or comment. The Babylonians took the bronze and the gold and the silver. They took the pillars and the sea and the lavers and the lampstands, but of the ark the text says nothing. It is not listed among the objects destroyed, nor is it listed among the objects carried away to Babylon. It is not mentioned as having been burned with the rest of the temple, nor is it mentioned as having been hidden or rescued before the destruction occurred. The ark simply ceases to exist in the biblical narrative as if it had never been, and the silence surrounding its fate has generated 25 centuries of speculation, legend, and searching. The question of what happened to the Ark of the Covenant has become one of the enduring mysteries of ancient history, a puzzle that has attracted the attention of scholars and adventurers, religious visionaries and popular entertainers, archaeologists and treasure hunters from antiquity to the present day. The silence of the biblical text has been interpreted in many different ways, leading to theories that range from the mundane to the miraculous, from the historically plausible to the wildly speculative. Some have argued that the silence indicates that the ark was simply destroyed, along with the rest of the temple, consumed in the flames that Nebuzaradan's soldiers kindled, and that the biblical writers did not mention it specifically because its loss was too painful to record in detail. According to this view, the ark was made of wood overlaid with gold, and wood burns, and therefore the ark perished in the conflagration that destroyed everything else within the Holy of Holies. The gold overlay would have melted and been recovered by the Babylonians along with all the other gold they carried away, and the acacia wood core would have been reduced to ashes, leaving nothing to identify as the ark itself. This explanation has the virtue of simplicity, and requires no special circumstances or hidden narratives, but it has never satisfied those who believe that an object of such supreme sacred significance would not have been allowed to perish without some word of mourning or memorial in the biblical text. Others have suggested that the ark was carried away to Babylon, along with the other temple treasures, but was simply not mentioned by name in the biblical inventory, perhaps because it was categorized under some other description, or because the writers deliberately omitted reference to it to avoid acknowledging that such a sacred object had fallen into pagan hands. According to this theory, the ark was taken to Babylon, along with the vessels of gold and silver, and was either destroyed there, melted down for its precious metal, or stored in one of the Babylonian temples as a trophy of conquest. When the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 before the Common Era and issued his decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple, the ark would not have been among the objects returned because it no longer existed, or because the Persians had no knowledge of what it was or where it had been stored. This theory also has the virtue of plausibility, explaining the ark's disappearance through the ordinary processes of conquest and plunder, but it too fails to account for the complete silence of the biblical text regarding the fate of the most important object in Israelite worship. A third possibility that has been advanced by various scholars and religious traditions holds that the ark was hidden before the Babylonian destruction, removed from the temple and concealed in a secret location where it remains to this day, waiting to be discovered at the appointed time. This theory has taken many forms over the centuries, with different traditions placing the hidden ark in different locations and attributing its concealment to different agents. The second book of Maccabees, a Jewish text written in Greek during the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, contains a tradition that the prophet Jeremiah was responsible for hiding the ark before the Babylonian army arrived. According to this account, Jeremiah, having received a divine oracle, gave orders that the tent and the ark should follow with him, and he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God. The mountain referred to is Mount Nebo, the peak in the land of Moab from which Moses had viewed the promised land before his death, and the text states that Jeremiah found a cave dwelling, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense, and then he sealed up the entrance. The Maccabean account further states that when some of those who followed Jeremiah came up to mark the way, they could not find the path, and when Jeremiah learned of this, he rebuked them and declared that the place would remain unknown, until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy, at which time the Lord would disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud would appear, as they were shown in the case of Moses, and as Solomon asked that the place should be specially consecrated. This tradition places the ark in a specific geographic location, the caves of Mount Nebo across the Jordan River from the land of Israel, but it also indicates that the ark is divinely protected from discovery until the Messianic age arrives and God himself reveals its location. The Mount Nebo tradition has inspired numerous expeditions and searches over the centuries, with explorers and archaeologists investigating the caves and ravines of the Transjordanian highlands in search of the hidden treasure, but no convincing evidence of the ark's presence has ever been found. Jewish traditions preserved in the Talmud and later rabbinic literature offer an alternative theory that places the hidden ark much closer to its original location, beneath the Temple Mount itself. According to these traditions, King Josiah, anticipating the destruction of the temple that the prophets had foretold, ordered that the ark be concealed in a special hiding place that had been prepared for this purpose beneath the floor of the Holy of Holies. The Talmud describes this hiding place in various ways, sometimes as a chamber beneath the foundation stone upon which the ark had rested, sometimes as a network of tunnels and passages that extended deep into the rock of the Temple Mount. When the Babylonians destroyed the temple, according to this tradition, they found only an empty chamber behind the veil, the ark having been safely hidden where no pagan conqueror could reach it. This theory has profound implications for the modern situation in Jerusalem, where the Temple Mount is one of the most sensitive and contested sites in the world, sacred to Jews as the location of their ancient temples and sacred to Muslims as the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The possibility that the ark might still lie beneath the Temple Mount has inspired intense interest among certain religious groups, while simultaneously making any archaeological investigation of the site virtually impossible due to the political and religious sensitivities involved. The Ethiopian tradition regarding the ark's location stands apart from all other theories in that it claims not merely to know where the ark is hidden, but to possess the ark itself in continuous custody from the time of Solomon to the present day. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian national epic whose compilation dates to the 14th century, though it incorporates much older traditions, the ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, around the 10th century before the Common Era. This would place the removal of the ark from Jerusalem several centuries before the Babylonian destruction, during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, meaning that when the Babylonians burned the temple, the Holy of Holies had already been empty for approximately 400 years. The Ethiopian tradition does not explain why the biblical text makes no mention of the ark's absence during all those intervening centuries, nor does it account for the numerous references in the historical books to the ark's presence in the temple during the reigns of later kings. But these inconsistencies have not diminished the fervour with which the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains its claim. According to Ethiopian tradition, The ark was brought first to the island of Tana Kirkos in Lake Tana, where it remained for several centuries before being moved to the ancient city of Axum, the capital of the Aksumite Empire that flourished in the Ethiopian highlands during the first millennium of the Common Era. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum is claimed to be the resting place of the ark from approximately the 4th century, when Christianity was established as the religion of the Aksumite state. Adjacent to the main church, which has been rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, stands a small chapel that was constructed in the 20th century specifically to house the ark, and it is within this modest building that the Ethiopian faithful believe the most sacred object in history resides to this day. The guardian of the ark is a single monk appointed for life who may never leave the chapel precincts once he assumes his sacred duty, and no one except this guardian is permitted to enter the chapel or to see the ark itself. Scholars and journalists who have visited Axum have been shown what are claimed to be the ceremonial cloths that cover the ark, and have been told detailed accounts of its appearance and condition, but the ark itself has never been made available for examination or verification by outside observers. The Ethiopian claim is complicated by the fact that replicas of the ark, called tablets, play a central role in Ethiopian Orthodox worship and are present in every Ethiopian church. Each tablet is a consecrated tablet, typically made of wood or stone, that represents the tablets of the law contained within the original ark, and serves as the sacred centre of each church's sanctuary. During major festivals, particularly the celebration of Timkat, which commemorates the baptism of Christ, the tabots are carried in procession through the streets wrapped in elaborate cloths, accompanied by singing and dancing that deliberately echoes the biblical account of David dancing before the ark when he brought it to Jerusalem. The presence of these numerous replicas throughout Ethiopia makes the claim of possessing the original ark both more plausible, in the sense that the tradition is deeply embedded in Ethiopian religious culture, and less plausible in the sense that it raises questions about how the original would be distinguished from the copies, and why it would require such protection when the copies are publicly displayed. The question of verification has haunted every serious investigation into the Ethiopian claim, and the circumstances surrounding the supposed ark in Axum present researchers with an epistemological problem that may be fundamentally insoluble. The guardian monk who serves as the sole custodian of the chapel has traditionally refused all requests for access, citing not obstruction, but rather the sacred nature of his charge and the theological impossibility of exposing the divine presence to ordinary human scrutiny. When journalists and documentary filmmakers have travelled to Axum seeking to investigate the claim, they have invariably been turned away at the chapel door, though many have been permitted to interview the guardian through the chapel's outer enclosure and to photograph the exterior of the small building where the ark is supposedly kept. These conversations have produced remarkably consistent descriptions of the object said to reside within, accounts that align closely with the biblical specifications of dimensions and materials, though skeptics have noted that any guardian familiar with the Book of Exodus would naturally describe the ark in terms that match the scriptural account regardless of what the chapel actually contained. The Ethiopian claim received unprecedented international attention in the final decades of the 20th century, when a British journalist named Graham Hancock published a book that traced his multi-year investigation into the ark's possible location. Hancock's research took him across 3 continents and into numerous archives and traditions, but it was the Ethiopian connection that ultimately convinced him that the ark might genuinely reside in Axum. His investigation examined the historical plausibility of the Kebra Nagast narrative, the archaeological evidence for early Jewish influence in Ethiopia, and the testimony of Ethiopian clergy and scholars who affirm the tradition with absolute conviction. While Hancock acknowledged that he had not seen the ark himself, and that definitive proof remained elusive, his work brought the Ethiopian claim to the attention of a global audience, and sparked renewed interest in what had previously been an obscure tradition known mainly to specialists in Ethiopian studies and biblical archaeology. The book's commercial success demonstrated the enduring fascination that the ark exercises over the popular imagination, while simultaneously illustrating the difficulty of separating legitimate historical inquiry from sensationalism when dealing with an object that operates simultaneously in the realms of religion, history, and myth. The archaeological and historical evidence for Jewish presence in Ethiopia extends back many centuries and provides at least a circumstantial foundation for the claim that religious objects or traditions might have travelled from Jerusalem to the Ethiopian highlands. The Beta Israel community, Ethiopian Jews who practiced a form of Judaism that appeared to preserve ancient elements lost in other Jewish traditions, maintained their distinctive religious identity in Ethiopia for centuries before their mass emigration to Israel in the 20th century. The origins of this community remain debated among scholars, with some arguing for an ancient migration from Israel during the First Temple period, and others proposing later origins through conversion or contact with Yemeni Jewish communities across the Red Sea. The Beta Israel observed Sabbath laws, practiced animal sacrifice, and maintained dietary restrictions similar to those found in the Hebrew Scriptures, though they did not possess knowledge of the Talmud or later rabbinic developments, suggesting that their tradition had branched off from the main stem of Jewish practice at an early date. While the Beta Israel tradition itself does not claim possession of the Ark of the Covenant, which is associated specifically with the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian tradition rather than the Jewish community, the presence of this ancient Jewish population demonstrates that religious and cultural connections between Ethiopia and ancient Israel were established early enough to make the transmission of sacred objects or traditions at least theoretically possible. The ancient kingdom of Aksum, which flourished in the Ethiopian highlands from approximately the 1st through the 7th centuries of the Common Era, maintained extensive trade connections with the Mediterranean world, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean commercial networks, creating multiple pathways through which religious influences could have travelled to the region. Aksumite merchants dealt in ivory, gold, incense, and other luxury goods that were in high demand throughout the ancient world, and their port city of Adulis on the Red Sea coast served as a major entrepot linking Africa with the trade routes of Asia and the Mediterranean. The adoption of Christianity by the Aksumite court in the 4th century, traditionally attributed to the influence of two Syrian missionaries named Frumentius and Aedesius, who had been shipwrecked on the Ethiopian coast, connected the kingdom to the broader Christian world and established institutional links with the Patriarchate of Alexandria in Egypt. The Aksumite kings commemorated their military victories and building projects with inscriptions in Greek, Ge'ez, and South Arabian scripts, demonstrating the cosmopolitan character of their civilization and their engagement with multiple cultural and religious traditions. Within this context of extensive international connection and religious transformation, the arrival of a sacred object from Jerusalem, whether in the distant past claimed by the Kebra Nagast or at some later date, would not have been impossible from a purely logistical standpoint. The Kebra Nagast itself, while compiled in its current form during the 14th century, incorporates traditions that may extend back considerably earlier, and its composition reflects the desire of Ethiopian monarchs to establish a direct genealogical connection between their dynasty and the royal house of Israel. The text presents itself not as fiction or legend, but as authentic history, recounting in elaborate detail the journey of the Queen of Sheba to Jerusalem, her encounter with Solomon, her conception of a son by the Israelite king, and the subsequent journey of that son Menelik to meet his father and to receive his inheritance. The account of how the ark came to Ethiopia varies in different versions of the tradition, with some presenting Menelik as having taken the ark with Solomon's knowledge and blessing, while others suggest that the removal was accomplished secretly through divine intervention, with the ark being miraculously transported from the Holy of Holies while a replica was left in its place. This latter version would explain why the biblical text continues to refer to the ark's presence in the temple after the supposed time of its removal, though critics have pointed out that this explanation appears designed specifically to address an obvious contradiction in the narrative. The Kebra Nagast served important political functions in Ethiopian history, legitimating the authority of the Solomonic dynasty that ruled Ethiopia from approximately the 13th century until the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974, and this political utility has led some scholars to question whether the text's claims should be understood as historical memory or as ideological construction serving the interests of the ruling class. The physical specifications described for the Aksum Ark align closely with the biblical account, which has been interpreted both as evidence for authenticity and as evidence that the description derives from the scriptural text rather than from independent observation of an actual object. According to those who claim to have received descriptions from the guardian monks, the ark is a rectangular chest of wood overlaid with gold, approximately the dimensions specified in Exodus, with rings for carrying poles and a lid surmounted by cherubim figures. The object is said to be kept wrapped in multiple layers of cloth within the chapel, protected from view even within its own enclosure. The guardian monks who have served over the years have reported experiencing various phenomena in the presence of the Ark that they attribute to its sacred power, though these accounts necessarily remain unverifiable. Some guardians have described physical sensations of heat or energy emanating from the object, while others have spoken of dreams, visions, and communications they believe to have come from the divine presence associated with the Ark. Whether these experiences reflect genuine encounters with something extraordinary, or the effects of intense religious devotion and cultural expectation upon human psychology, they have reinforced the conviction of successive generations of Ethiopian Christians that their church possesses the authentic Ark of the Covenant. Attempts to subject the Ethiopian claim to scientific investigation have been repeatedly frustrated by the religious restrictions surrounding access to the object. In the 1980s and 1990s, various researchers proposed using non-invasive technologies such as ground-penetrating radar or remote sensing equipment to examine the chapel and its contents without physically entering the sacred space. But these proposals were declined by the Ethiopian church authorities, who maintained that the sacred nature of the Ark rendered any such investigation inappropriate, regardless of how it was conducted. The question of whether the Ethiopian church would ever permit scientific verification remains unresolved, with some observers suggesting that the very impossibility of verification serves the institutional interests of the church by maintaining an aura of mystery that draws pilgrims and reinforces Ethiopian national identity, while others have argued that the church's refusal to permit examination reflects genuine religious conviction rather than strategic calculation. The paradox of the Ethiopian claim lies in its simultaneous specificity and unverifiability, offering precise details about location and custody, while preventing any independent confirmation of those details. The alternative theories regarding the Ark's fate continued to proliferate throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, many of them drawing on combinations of biblical scholarship, archaeological speculation, and creative imagination that proved difficult to untangle. The theory that the Ark was hidden beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem before the Babylonian destruction gained adherents among both Jewish religious authorities and secular researchers, though for very different reasons and with very different implications. For traditional Jewish authorities, the belief that the Ark remained hidden beneath the holy mountain carried profound theological significance, suggesting that the sacred object continued to exert its sanctifying presence over the site even in the absence of the temple, and would one day be revealed when conditions were appropriate for the rebuilding of the sanctuary. The rabbinical traditions recorded in the Talmud and later commentaries describe an elaborate system of underground chambers and tunnels beneath the Temple Mount, some of which were said to have been constructed specifically to serve as hiding places for sacred objects in times of danger. These traditions hold that King Josiah, who reigned over Judah in the late 7th century before the Common Era and who conducted extensive religious reforms recorded in the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles, recognized that the temple would eventually be destroyed and ordered the Ark to be hidden in these underground chambers to preserve it from the invading armies. The idea that the Ark lies beneath the foundation stone waiting to be rediscovered has inspired numerous proposals for archaeological investigation of the Temple Mount, though all such proposals have been blocked by the political and religious sensitivities surrounding the site, which is sacred to Jews, Muslims and Christians, and which remains one of the most contested pieces of real estate on Earth. The Knights Templar theory represents a fascinating confluence of medieval history, esoteric speculation, and modern popular culture that has proven remarkably durable, despite the absence of substantial historical evidence. The Templars, a military religious order founded in Jerusalem during the Crusades, were based for nearly 2 centuries on the Temple Mount itself, having established their headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they converted into a church and palace. During their long residence on the Temple Mount, according to various conspiracy theories and alternative histories, the Templars conducted extensive excavations beneath the site and discovered the hidden chamber containing the Ark of the Covenant, which they then removed and transported to Europe when the Crusader states collapsed in the late 13th century. This theory gained traction from the Templars' reputation for secrecy, their immense wealth, and the mysterious circumstances of their suppression in the early 14th century, when the French king Philip IV, apparently motivated by a desire to seize their assets, brought charges of heresy and blasphemy against the order and had its leaders burned at the stake. The sudden and violent end of the Templars left numerous questions about the disposition of their property and the nature of their secret rituals, questions that have been filled by successive generations of speculation about hidden treasures and esoteric knowledge. various locations in Europe have been proposed as possible hiding places for the Templar Ark, including the famous Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which features elaborate stone carvings of unusual imagery and which was built by a family with alleged Templar connections approximately a century after the Order's suppression. Rosslyn Chapel has attracted particular attention from Ark hunters due to several coincidental features that have been interpreted as clues to the presence of hidden treasures. The chapel's carvings include depictions of plants that appear to represent New World species such as maize and aloe, leading some researchers to propose that the chapel's builders possessed knowledge that predated the official European discovery of the Americas. These botanical anomalies have been woven into broader theories suggesting that the Templars, or their successors, possessed secret knowledge and sacred objects that they concealed in elaborate ways. Beneath the chapel floor lies a sealed vault that has never been opened in modern times, the contents of which remain unknown and the subject of endless speculation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the chapel have identified anomalies consistent with underground chambers and metallic objects, though the results have been interpreted differently by different observers and have not produced definitive evidence for or against the presence of the Ark or any other major treasure. The chapel remains in active use as a place of worship and has become a major tourist attraction, drawing visitors who seek to unravel its mysteries while contributing to the local economy and generating ongoing controversy about whether its secrets should be investigated or left undisturbed. The theory that the Ark was taken to Egypt represents one of the oldest alternative explanations for its disappearance, drawing on a brief and enigmatic reference in the biblical text to a raid on Jerusalem by an Egyptian pharaoh identified as Shishak during the reign of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. According to the first book of Kings, Shishak came up against Jerusalem in the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, carrying away all the gold shields that Solomon had made. The text does not specifically mention the Ark among the items taken, but some researchers have suggested that it might have been included among the treasures of the house of the Lord without being separately identified. The pharaoh Shishak has been tentatively identified with Shoshank, the founder of the 22nd dynasty of Egypt, who left inscriptions at the Temple of Karnak recording his military campaigns in Palestine and listing numerous cities that he claimed to have conquered. However, the Karnak inscriptions do not include Jerusalem among the conquered cities, raising questions about whether the biblical account accurately describes the extent of Shishak's campaign, or whether the payment described in Kings represented tribute rather than plunder. The theory that the Ark was taken to Egypt has led some researchers to propose that it might have been deposited in an Egyptian temple or treasury, perhaps eventually finding its way to the great temple complexes at Thebes or Memphis, where it would have been one treasure among many, and might have been melted down for its gold content or simply lost track of amid the chaos of subsequent centuries. The connection between the Ark and ancient Egypt extends beyond this single military raid to encompass broader questions about the relationship between Israelite religion and Egyptian culture. Moses himself, according to the biblical narrative, was raised in the Egyptian court and educated in the wisdom of the Egyptians before his encounter with the divine at the burning bush and his subsequent mission to lead the Israelites out of slavery. Some scholars have noted apparent parallels between the Ark of the Covenant and sacred objects in Egyptian religious practice, particularly the portable shrines and sacred barks that were carried in procession during Egyptian festivals and that housed images of the gods. These Egyptian ritual objects were typically rectangular chests mounted on carrying poles and covered with gold, features that correspond closely to the biblical description of the Ark, leading some researchers to propose that the Israelite Ark represented an adaptation or transformation of Egyptian religious forms into the service of the distinctive theology of Israel. Whether this apparent similarity reflects genuine cultural borrowing, independent development of similar solutions to similar ritual needs, or later literary imagination shaped by Egyptian models remains a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. But the possible Egyptian background of the Ark has fueled speculation that the object might have been recognized by Egyptians as related to their own sacred traditions, and therefore treated with special interest if it came into their possession. The modern era has witnessed the development of increasingly elaborate theories about the Ark's location and fate, many of them drawing on advances in technology, archaeology, and textual scholarship, while others venture into territory that most mainstream academics would characterize as speculation or fantasy. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves near the ruins of Qumran in the mid-20th century sparked a new wave of interest in the possibility that other ancient treasures might remain hidden in the wilderness of Judea, preserved by the arid climate that had kept the scrolls intact for 2,000 years. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls was a remarkable document known as the Copper Scroll, unique among the Qumran texts in being inscribed on metal rather than parchment, and in containing what appeared to be a detailed list of hidden treasures with specific locations given for each deposit. The Copper Scroll describes enormous quantities of gold, silver, and sacred objects that were supposedly concealed in various locations throughout the land of Israel, leading some researchers to propose that it represented a genuine inventory of temple treasures hidden before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era. While most scholars have concluded that the Copper Scroll describes quantities of precious metals far exceeding what was likely to have been available, and that its contents should be understood as fictional, legendary, or symbolic, rather than as a practical treasure map, the document has continued to inspire expeditions and investigations by those who hope to discover ancient treasures in the Judean wilderness. The question of whether the Copper Scroll might contain any authentic information about the hiding places of sacred objects has intersected with the broader quest for the Ark of the Covenant in ways that illuminate both the persistence of the mystery and the methodological challenges that face any serious investigation of it. The scroll's references to vessels, implements, and treasures associated with temple worship have led some researchers to propose that even if the specific quantities of gold and silver described in the document are exaggerated or symbolic, the underlying tradition of hidden temple objects might preserve genuine historical memory of efforts to conceal sacred items before the catastrophes that periodically befell Jerusalem. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between authentic historical tradition, literary or theological elaboration, and outright invention, a problem that affects virtually every ancient source that touches upon the Ark's fate. The modern archaeological enterprise in the lands of the Bible has produced remarkable discoveries that have transformed understanding of ancient Israelite history and religion, including inscriptions, seals, architectural remains, and artifacts that have confirmed, complicated, or challenged the biblical narrative in various ways. Yet despite more than a century and a half of systematic excavation and survey, no archaeological discovery has provided definitive evidence for the existence or fate of the Ark of the Covenant. This absence of physical evidence should perhaps not be surprising, given the rarity of wooden objects in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East, where the combination of humidity, insects, and organic decay typically destroys such materials within centuries, unless exceptional conditions of preservation intervene. The Ark's core of acacia wood, even with its gold overlay, would have been vulnerable to deterioration over the millennia, and if the object was destroyed or dismantled at any point in its history, the gold components might well have been melted down and reused, leaving no trace that could be identified as belonging specifically to the ancient sacred object. The archaeological silence regarding the Ark stands in notable contrast to the textual richness of traditions about its nature, history, and fate, creating a situation in which scholars must rely primarily on textual analysis and comparative study, rather than on the material evidence that grounds so much other historical investigation. The 20th century witnessed the emergence of increasingly creative and sometimes sensational theories about the Ark's location, many of them driven by individuals operating outside the mainstream academic establishment and motivated by religious conviction, desire for adventure, or commercial interest. The explorer and author Graham Hancock brought international attention to the Ethiopian claim with his book on the subject published in the 1980s, in which he argued that the Ark had indeed been taken to Ethiopia in ancient times, and that it remained in the chapel at Aksum as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained. Hancock's work combined historical research, travel narrative, and speculative reconstruction in ways that captured popular imagination, while drawing criticism from academic specialists who questioned his methodology and conclusions. The book's commercial success demonstrated the enduring public fascination with the Ark mystery, while also illustrating the tension between popular interest in dramatic discoveries and scholarly caution about extraordinary claims. Other investigators have focused their attention on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem itself, the site where Solomon's temple once stood, and where the Ark was housed for nearly 4 centuries before its disappearance. The Temple Mount presents unique challenges for archaeological investigation because it remains one of the most politically and religiously sensitive locations on Earth, sacred to Judaism as the site of the ancient temples, and to Islam as the location of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, from which, according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during his night journey. The religious and political sensitivities surrounding the Temple Mount have effectively prevented systematic archaeological excavation of the platform itself, although study of its visible architecture, analysis of debris removed from the site during construction projects, and investigation of the underground cisterns and passages that honeycomb the platform have provided some information about its history and structure. The possibility that the Ark might be concealed somewhere beneath the Temple Mount, preserved in a hidden chamber or tunnel from the time of the First Temple, has generated enormous interest among those who hope for its discovery, while raising profound concerns about the potential consequences of any such find for the delicate religious and political equilibrium that currently governs the site. The Israeli archaeologist and Rabbi Yehuda Getz, who served as rabbi of the Western Wall in Jerusalem during the 1980s, reportedly believed that the Ark was hidden in a chamber beneath the Temple Mount and attempted to investigate tunnels that he thought might lead to its location, an effort that was halted by Israeli authorities due to concerns about provoking conflict with the Muslim religious authorities who administer the platform. The episode illustrated both the intense desire among some believers to locate the Ark and the practical and political obstacles that constrain any investigation of the most likely place for its concealment. The Temple Mount remains, for many, the most plausible location for the Ark if it survived the Babylonian destruction, yet it also remains the most inaccessible location for archaeological investigation, a circumstance that guarantees the continuation of the mystery for the foreseeable future. The theories proposing European locations for the Ark have generally centred on the Knights Templar, the medieval military religious order that was founded in Jerusalem during the Crusades, and that became one of the most powerful and wealthy organisations in Christendom before its dramatic suppression in the early 14th century. The Templars established their headquarters on the Temple Mount during the period of Crusader control of Jerusalem, occupying the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they converted into their principal residence, and from which they took their name as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The Templars' presence on the Temple Mount has led to speculation that they might have discovered the Ark or other treasures hidden beneath the platform and removed them to Europe, where they might have been concealed in one of the Order's many properties across the continent. The sudden suppression of the Templars by King Philip IV of France in 1307, executed with coordinated arrests across multiple kingdoms, and followed by trials, torture, and the execution of the Order's leaders, generated a rich body of legend about Templar secrets and hidden treasures that has continued to grow over the subsequent centuries. The Scottish connection to this tradition centres on the possibility that Templars fleeing the suppression might have taken refuge in Scotland, which was then engaged in its war of independence against England, and where the authority of the Pope who had ordered the Templars' dissolution might have been less rigorously enforced. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the mid-15th century by the Sinclair family near Edinburgh, has become a focal point for theories about Templar treasure due to its elaborate and unusual architectural decoration, which includes carvings that some interpreters have connected to Templar symbolism or to encoded messages about hidden secrets. The chapel gained widespread popular attention through its prominent role in a best-selling novel of the early 21st century and the subsequent film adaptation, which presented it as a repository of sacred relics and hidden knowledge. Serious historians have generally viewed these theories with scepticism, noting that the chapel was built more than a century after the Templars' suppression, and that the evidence for any connection between the Sinclair family and Templar refugees remains circumstantial at best, but the romantic appeal of the Scottish connection has ensured its continued popularity among those who seek the Ark in unexpected places. Similar theories have proposed that the Ark might have been brought to France and concealed at the Cathedral of Chartres, whose construction in the 12th and 13th centuries coincided with the height of Templar power, and whose elaborate sculptural program includes images that some interpreters have connected to the Ark of the Covenant. One portal of the cathedral depicts a scene often identified as the transport of the Ark, showing a wheeled vehicle carrying what appears to be a chest, an image that has been interpreted by some as indicating that the cathedral's builders possessed knowledge about the Ark's location or nature. More conventional art historical interpretation identifies the image as depicting a scene from Old Testament history, without any implications for the Ark's actual fate, but the persistence of alternative interpretations demonstrates the way in which the Ark quest has generated elaborate symbolic readings of medieval art and architecture. The Ethiopian tradition stands apart from these European speculations by virtue of its antiquity, its institutional backing, and the living religious practice that surrounds it. While the Templar theories are largely the product of modern speculation drawing on medieval history, the Ethiopian claim is embedded in the national and religious identity of a living community that has maintained the tradition for many centuries, and that continues to centre its religious observance on the presence of what it believes to be the authentic Ark. The Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian text that narrates the story of Menelik's removal of the Ark from Jerusalem, was compiled in the 14th century, but draws on traditions of considerably greater antiquity, and its account has shaped Ethiopian self-understanding and religious practice in profound ways that continue to the present day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's practice of housing a tablet, or replica of the Ark, in the Holy of Holies of every church, and the central role of the tablet in liturgical celebrations, particularly during the festival of Timkat, which commemorates the baptism of Christ, demonstrate the living significance of the Ark tradition in Ethiopian Christianity. The Chapel of St. Mary of Zion in Axum, where the Ark is believed to be housed, was built in the 1960s to replace an earlier structure that had itself replaced still earlier buildings on a site that has been sacred to Ethiopian Christianity for many centuries. The current guardian of the Ark, a monk appointed to the position by the previous guardian, lives in seclusion on the chapel grounds and is the only person permitted to enter the small building where the object is kept. No photographs of the interior have been published, no scientific examination has been permitted, and no outside observer has been allowed to view the object claimed to be the Ark. This absolute restriction on access has generated both frustration among those who seek verification and respect among those who recognise the Guardian's role as protecting a sacred tradition from secular intrusion. The Ethiopian Church maintains that the restriction is not intended to conceal fraud, but rather to protect the overwhelming holiness of the object, which is believed to be dangerous to those who approach it unworthily, a belief that echoes the biblical accounts of the fatal power of the Ark when touched by unauthorized persons. The question of whether the object in Axum is genuinely the Ark of the Covenant, a replica or substitute created at some point in Ethiopian history, or something else entirely remains unanswerable given the current restrictions on examination. Scholars who have studied the Ethiopian tradition have noted that even if the Menelik story is legendary rather than historical, the Ethiopian Church's possession of an ancient and sacred object connected to the Ark tradition does not necessarily require acceptance of the full narrative framework of the Kebra Nagast. Some have proposed that a sacred object might have been brought to Ethiopia from Jerusalem at some point in antiquity, perhaps during the turbulent centuries following the Babylonian destruction, or during the period of Jewish settlement in Upper Egypt and Ethiopia that is attested in various ancient sources, and that this object became identified with or understood as the Ark of the Covenant whether or not it was originally the chest described in Exodus. The difficulty of reconstructing the historical processes by which sacred traditions develop and transform over time means that the Ethiopian claim cannot be definitively verified or refuted on the basis of available evidence, leaving it as one of the most intriguing and most frustrating elements of the Ark mystery. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have witnessed periodic announcements of discoveries that supposedly shed light on the Ark's location or fate, none of which have withstood scholarly scrutiny. In 2007, a self-described biblical archaeologist claimed to have found evidence that the Ark had been taken to an ancient temple site in the wilderness of Judea, but his claims were rejected by mainstream archaeologists who found his methodology and evidence unconvincing. Similar announcements have emerged from investigators claiming to have located the Ark in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, beneath the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, and in various other locations, generating media attention before fading from view when the promised verification failed to materialize. The pattern of sensational claims followed by scholarly rejection has become familiar enough that new announcements are typically greeted with considerable skepticism by those who have followed the history of such claims, yet the cycle continues as the enduring human fascination with the lost treasure of Israel continues to inspire new searches and new theories. The technological developments of the modern era have added new dimensions to the quest, while also highlighting the limitations of available methods. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and other remote sensing technologies have been proposed as means of locating hidden chambers or objects beneath archaeological sites without the need for excavation. and such technologies have indeed proven valuable in other archaeological contexts. Yet the application of these methods to the Ark quest has been limited by the political and religious restrictions that govern access to the most promising locations, particularly the Temple Mount, and by the fundamental uncertainty about what physical traces the Ark might have left if it was hidden, destroyed, or removed in antiquity. The technologies that can detect voids and anomalies beneath the surface cannot distinguish between a hidden chamber that might contain the Ark and one that contains other objects or nothing at all, and the political impossibility of excavation at the most sensitive sites means that anomalies detected by remote sensing cannot be investigated further. The religious significance of the Ark has continued to evolve in the centuries since its disappearance, taking on new meanings in Jewish, Christian, and broader cultural contexts that extend far beyond the object's original function, as described in the Hebrew Scriptures. In Jewish tradition, the loss of the Ark is associated with the loss of the divine presence that once dwelt among the people of Israel, a theological tragedy that is commemorated in the rituals of mourning that mark the fast of Tisha B'Av, when Jews remember the destruction of both temples and the exiles that followed. The hope for the restoration of the Ark is connected in some traditions with the messianic hope for the rebuilding of the temple and the return of the divine presence, though other Jewish voices have emphasized that the divine presence is not confined to any physical location or object, and that the spiritual reality symbolized by the Ark transcends its material form. The empty space in the Holy of Holies of the Second Temple, where the Ark had once stood, became in a rabbinic thought a symbol of the continued presence of the divine even in absence, a theological concept that has profound implications for Jewish understanding of God's relationship with the world and with Israel. In Christian tradition, the Ark was understood from early centuries as a type or prefiguration of deeper spiritual realities, particularly the Virgin Mary, who was seen as the living Ark who carried within her body the incarnate Word of God just as the original Ark had carried the tablets of the divine law. This typological interpretation, which appears in the writings of Church Fathers and in the liturgy of the Church, transformed the Ark from a lost physical object into an enduring symbol of divine incarnation and salvation. The Book of Revelation's vision of the heavenly temple, in which the Ark of the Covenant appears in the temple of God in heaven, suggested to Christian interpreters that the true Ark was not to be sought on earth, but rather in the spiritual reality of which the earthly Ark had been a shadow or copy. This spiritualizing interpretation did not entirely eliminate Christian interest in the physical fate of the Ark, as evidenced by the Ethiopian tradition and by various medieval legends and relics, but it did provide a theological framework within which the loss of the physical Ark could be understood as part of a larger divine purpose, rather than simply as a historical tragedy. The popular cultural fascination with the Ark reached new heights with the release of the film Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, which brought the ancient mystery to a global audience and established the Ark as an iconic element of adventure storytelling. The film's portrayal of the Ark as an object of terrifying supernatural power, capable of destroying those who looked upon it with faces melting and spirits emerging from its opened lid, drew on biblical accounts of the Ark's dangerous holiness, while adding dramatic elements from horror and science fiction traditions. The success of the film and its sequels ensured that the Ark of the Covenant became one of the most widely recognized religious artifacts in the world, familiar even to audiences with no knowledge of the biblical texts or the historical questions surrounding the object's fate. This popular recognition has generated both benefits and challenges for serious scholarship on the Ark, increasing public interest in the subject, while also creating expectations shaped more by cinematic imagination than by historical or archaeological realities. The enduring power of the Ark in human imagination reflects something deeper than mere curiosity about a lost treasure or fascination with ancient mysteries. The Ark represents the human longing for encounter with the divine, for tangible evidence of transcendent reality, for an object that bridges the gap between the ordinary world and the realm of ultimate meaning. The Hebrew Scriptures present the Ark as the place where heaven and earth meet, where the invisible God makes his presence known to his people, where the infinite condescends to dwell within the finite. The loss of such an object represents more than the disappearance of a valuable artifact. It represents the apparent withdrawal of divine presence, the silence of heaven, the unbridgeable distance between the human and the holy. The quest for the Ark, whether conducted by scholars in libraries, by explorers in deserts and mountains, or by believers in prayer and contemplation, is ultimately a quest for that presence, for the recovery of something precious that has been lost not only to history but to the human heart. The chapel of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum continues to stand in the Ethiopian highlands, surrounded by the ancient stelae and ruins that mark the city's past as the capital of a great empire. Within its walls, behind doors that remain closed to the outside world, the Guardian continues his vigil over what the Ethiopian faithful believe to be the most sacred object on earth. Whether the Ark of the Covenant truly rests within that small building, or whether it lies hidden beneath the streets of Jerusalem, or whether it was destroyed in the fires of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest and exists now only in memory and hope, the mystery endures. The smoke that once rose from the summit of Sinai has long since dispersed into the desert sky, and the voices that once spoke from between the cherubim have fallen silent, yet the questions they raised continue to echo across the centuries. The Ark of the Covenant, whether it survives as a physical object hidden in Ethiopia or Jerusalem or some other place, or whether it exists now only as a symbol and a memory, has carried within it something more enduring than gold and acacia wood. It has carried the human conviction that the divine can enter into relationship with the mortal, that the infinite can dwell within the finite, that the creator of all things can choose to make a home among his creatures. The golden chest with its mysterious cherubim, the tablets inscribed with the divine law, the mercy seat from which the voice of God spoke to Moses, all of these elements of the biblical description point toward a reality that transcends the physical object itself, toward the fundamental human intuition that beyond the visible world there exists something greater, something holier, something worth seeking even across millennia of searching and centuries of silence. The Ark may never be found, or it may already be found and kept hidden, or it may reveal itself in some future age that no one can now foresee. But the longing it represents, the hope it embodies, the questions it raises about the nature of the sacred and the possibility of encounter with the divine, these will endure as long as human beings lift their eyes from the dust of the earth and wonder what might dwell beyond the boundaries of their knowledge. In the end, the story of the Ark of the Covenant is not primarily a story about a lost object, though the mystery of its disappearance has captivated imaginations for more than 2,500 years. It is a story about the human relationship with the transcendent, about the ways in which communities construct sacred space and sacred time, about the tension between the universal and the particular in religious experience, about the persistence of hope in the face of loss, and the endurance of memory across generations. The ark that Moses built in the wilderness, that Joshua carried across the Jordan, that David brought dancing into Jerusalem, that Solomon placed in the Holy of Holies of his great temple, that vanished from history in the flames of Babylon, that is sought still in the mountains of Ethiopia and the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. That object has become something more than itself, has become a symbol of all that is most precious and most elusive in the human quest for meaning. The smoke has cleared from the mountain. The temple lies in ruins. The exile has never truly ended. Yet somewhere, perhaps in Aksum or Jerusalem or in a place no one has yet imagined, the Ark of the Covenant waits in darkness, holding within its golden walls the memory of a voice that once spoke from between the cherubim and promised that God would dwell among his people forever.